Hello, everyone. Hopefully, you would have just watched the previous session and you should expect to be seeing me right now. But if we're on demand, then where have you all been? So this session's going out at 20 to 8 UK time, which is quite late for me. Usually I'd be on the sofa watching TV, chilling after a hard day's work. But today I'm with you, and our next session is with Dave Horton, and Dave's a good friend of mine. And the first time we met was actually in person. Was the first ComCon now 4 years ago, and he's been a dear friend ever since. And he's the creator of Dractio, which I love as a web type developer. Who knows enough SIP to get into trouble, but not enough SIP to understand absolutely everything. Dractio is absolutely perfect for me. And then he went off and built Jambones. But he's not going to be talking about Jambones or Dractio today. He's going to be talking about licensing and licenses and open source. So I'm going to pass you off onto Dave, the recording of Dave. And then I'm going to catch up with you after he's spoken his words of wisdom. So take it away, Dave.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, everybody. I'm Dave Horton, and I'm super happy to be part of ComCon 2021, both having the chance to present you as well as being a community sponsor. And I've got something that's a little bit different for you today, I think. Usually I talk on a technical topic, and today my talk is non-technical, but it's a talk I've been wanting to give for some time, and I'm really excited to be here at ComCon 2021 to give it. The title of my talk is Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places, Why Your OSS License Won't Save You. I'm going to talk a little bit about open source software licensing, but I'm going to talk a lot about creating sustainable open source communities. First, a few bits about me. I manage two open source projects, one called Dractio and one called Jambones. Dractio is a SIP application server, and Jambones is an open source CPaaS that you can self-host, designed for privacy conscious service providers and customers. Since we're talking about licenses here, both happen to be MIT licensed. In my day job, I run a VoIP consultancy, mostly focused around providing service around these two open source projects and support. And previously, I worked on the commercial side of things, founding a commercial VoIP software company. So in this talk, I hope to do three things. First, convince you that your choice of OSS license has less to do with your project success than you think. You know, I think we often look at OSS license as a kind of oracle that we can come to and lay our problems at the feet of. And if we've chosen the right oracle, the right license, then all our wishes will come true. I'm going to convince you that's not quite the case. Really, what I want to do in this talk is introduce a new framework for trying to understand what causes successful OSS communities. And I want to look far afield to do that. I want to look at other sciences and other disciplines to see what we can learn and bring back in our day-to-day life in the real-time communications open source space. And use that framework to talk about challenges using basically a new set of glasses to kind of examine them, if you will. Now, you all know the three rules of OSS licenses, right? Well, there are no such three rules, but I have opinions, so maybe these are Dave's three rules of OSS licenses. There's only three, and the first one is creators of software intellectual property should be free to license it as they see fit. I think we'd all agree to that. Secondly, consumers of software or the intellectual property should abide by the terms it's licensed under. Again, I think we'd all agree with that. The third one is important. The third one is everything else is commentary. Now, I've stolen that line, and you'll see from where later in the presentation. This is a very austere vision of software licensing, if you will, in terms of what it says and what it doesn't say. But I think it's also useful because it says, for instance, that the endless discussions that we have about this license is better than that license are really pointless. We can no more say one license is better than another license than we could say this color is better than that color for painting. It's completely in the eye of the beholder, and the creator of the software intellectual property, who had an agenda and chose a license based on that, is really the only one that can judge. Let's take the case of fake open source license, open license, the people we love to hate. I bring this up as an example just because it's somewhat timely. Apollo recently moved from an MIT to an Elastic license, and you can see here they put out a message to their user base why they moved to the new license. And it's kind of interesting in a few ways. What's interesting to me is what sort of leaps off the page at me anyways, and I've kind of highlighted it here, is this sense of really being aggrieved. Stewards of our community, we have a responsibility to prevent harm from anyone who tends to exploit our work. And when I read it, it raises the obvious question, how is using software as per its licensed terms exploiting our work? And where does this sense of being aggrieved come from? Because after all, they created the intellectual property. They chose to license it under MIT license. People, including cloud providers, then utilized it, adhering to those licenses. What they're really saying, I think, is this. We selected a license to support a business model. We thought we would get that outcome. The business model that we planned was that some number of people will download our software. Some smaller percent of those will be paying customers for services. What actually happened was different. There was an unforeseen event. Cloud providers started hosting a service. Our customer base was much less than we expected. The customer base was even lower percentage than we expected because of the existence of this cloud service. And the result is we feel aggrieved. All that's understandable. But to me, the real problem is that you use a blunt instrument, software license, to do surgery, something that required a precision that it didn't have. You wanted to achieve a specific business outcome. So my point is really simple. It's just that licenses have their shortcomings and limits. They're not an oracle that we just need to choose and then lay our problems at the feet of. We ask them to do too much, and for some reason, we talk endlessly about them. So your choice of OSS license is really only one tool when it comes to creating a sustainable and healthy OSS community. So let's up our game a little bit. I want to talk now about building healthy OSS communities. And when I talk about OSS, I of course mean open source software, and I'm specifically talking about in the real-time community, RTC. So I'll say RTC OSS. I'm not talking about open source writ large. I'm not talking about Linux and philosophies of open source. I'm really talking about our community that we make a living in every day, the RTC OSS community. If we're interested in building healthy communities, I think we should look to what other sciences have to say on the conditions in general for healthy, self-regulated communities. And I'm going to look at two sciences in particular, economics and evolutionary biology, and ask what insights or lessons can we draw from those places that we could bring back. Okay, to do that, to start with, I have to teach you a little bit about economics. And fun fact about me, my first job out of uni, as you Brits say, was as an economist. So economists have this sort of two-column chart for categorizing goods and services based on two dimensions: the subtractability of an item or a good and its excludability. So by subtractability, we mean when someone consumes one unit of it, is there less for everyone else? If I go into a store and buy a candy bar, there's less candy bars for everyone else. That's a subtractable kind of product, and we're used to those. Things that are not subtractable, a good example would be, let's see. Well, actually, the best example is one we're all familiar with, digital software. If someone downloads 99 copies of my software, it's not like there's less for the 100th person. There's the same amount. So digital software and digital products are not subtractable. The other dimension is excludability. How easy is it to exclude? So we're familiar, again, the candy bar is easy to exclude. It's a product that's easy to exclude people from because it's got a price and people have to be willing to have that amount of money to buy the product. Things that are hard to exclude, the best example would be national security. Once you pay for it, everybody gets it. Okay, the interesting part about this chart is the bottom row. Common pool, what are called, economists call common pool resources and public goods, which are things that are hard to exclude, but if they're not subtractable, they're a public good. If they're subtractable, they're a common pool resource. So the question is, what is open source software? Is it a public good or is it a common pool resource? Now, based on the example I've already given you, digital software, not subtractable, you might say it's a public good. I'll claim actually it's a common pool resource, because if you think about open source software and you think about the process of people adopting it, think of the questions they ask when they come to the project. They ask questions like, is it active? How many contributors are there? Do the core developers care about my use cases? What they're asking about is the attention of the developer, and what they're trying to claim, stake a claim on, is the attention of the developer. That's a finite resource, and it's a subtractable resource. If I spend an hour with you, that's one less hour I have to spend with someone else who's working with my software. So based on that, I claim open source software is a common pool resource. Okay, why did I drag you through all of that? Hopefully not for nothing. The reason is that a lot of study has been done on common pool resources and the management of common pool resources, and I think we can learn something from those studies. So let's switch now to talk about or the field of economics. And something really interesting happened in 2009. In 2009, someone won the Nobel Prize for economics, who most people in the field had never heard of. Can you imagine that? Someone wins the top prize and many people in the field don't even know who she is. This was Elinor Ostrom, and she had done a lot of studies on common pool resource systems, things like fisheries. Up here where I live, near the coast of Maine, there are a lot of lobster fisheries, and these are areas, might encompass a region of a bay, where fishers have to coordinate, or lobstermen have to coordinate. They don't own the property, so they can't stake claims in that way. There are no regulations, but they've somehow got to coordinate on how they access this limited resource of lobsters in this property where nobody has property rights. Irrigation systems. She looked at irrigation systems in many countries where you may have a valley and a group of farmers that need to coordinate on the irrigation system. So as the Nobel Prize Committee wrote, it was long unanimously held amongst economists that natural resources that were collectively used by the users would be overexploited and destroyed in the long term. So side note, that's what economists call the tragedy of the commons. And this was the accepted wisdom until Elinor Ostrom came along. She disproved this idea by conducting field studies on how people in small local communities shared natural resources. She found that sometimes they succeeded. Quite often, they didn't. There were failures, and those ecosystems imploded, were overexploited and destroyed, but sometimes they succeeded. And then she codified 8 rules, and she called them design principles, that seemed to be present in all the success cases and seem to be a causal factor. So let's look at those 8 principles and see what we can draw back in our world of open source software. The very first one was strong group identity and understanding of purpose. All these successful groups had strong group identity. Now this is all, a very simple kind of thing. It almost means being able to draw a line around the group and understand who's in the group and who's not in the group. But it actually says a lot to us, particularly to OSS creators, because what I have observed or felt is that in a lot of cases, we OSS creators draw the line around ourselves and the core team. We're the creators. It's like we're a rock and roll band. There's an audience. Their job is to show up and buy tickets. But all the behavioral norms, what time do we how hard are we going to practice? What time do we show up for shows? How willing do members need to be to step back and give a solo to someone else? All those norms apply to the band, to us. So, and this is completely faulty. This isn't the model we should have at all, because when we leave consumers of open source software out of the group, they won't be subject to the norms of behavior we're trying to establish. So for us to, on the one hand, complain that consumers are not contributing, on the other hand, be driving them out of the group is kind of ludicrous. So the first lesson I think we can bring back from this is be inclusive. Include and respect those who consume versus create OSS software, even when you feel they're not contributing. Because if they're not part of the in-group, they're not going to be subject to the norms that you're trying to establish, like contributing, right? The proper way to think about them, I think, is as co-creators. If you're an OSS producer, you, together with your consumers, are co-creators of a useful experience for people in the most general sense. That's what you're doing. and you wrote the code to do it, but they lifted that code off the page, brought it to life in a sense by taking it to a market. You made sacrifices. You might have worked long hours for no pay. They might have made sacrifices too. They might have taken financial risks to bring it to the market. So be inclusive and draw that boundary around your customers, because for no reason other than the tactical reason of you want them to be subject to agreed upon norms of behavior. The second thing that she found in these groups, there was a fair distribution of costs and benefits. It wasn't like one party, absorbed all the benefits and one party absorbed all the costs. My observation is this is a concern in many OSS projects. Going right back to the example of Apollo we saw before, there's this concept of being exploited by free riders. And when we talk that way or complain that way, we're signaling this sense of unfair distribution of costs and benefits. There's a lesson here, I think. I think for OSS creators, the first lesson is take a broader view of the benefits of creating open source. It's not only about direct funding, which is something we all like to see, and it's the source of a lot of complaints perhaps, but there are more benefits as well. So there's important non-financial benefits that need to be counted, like reputation building. When you're building open source, really you're building a reputation, which you then monetize. So don't ignore that. Be open to the understanding that there are more benefits than just getting funding, and try to educate your consumers to deliver these benefits. I think a lot of consumers of open source feel like they're being asked to do direct contribution, and that's the only thing that matters, and that's the only thing that people want. There are a lot of ways to contribute to a project that costs little or nothing to help, for instance, reputation building. Over the past year, I tried to start a campaign on Twitter called List Your Open Source, because here's something that costs nothing for a consumer to do. Simply to list, here's the open source we use in our products, we're proud of them, we think they're best in class. You get that from a tier 1 customer. That means a lot in terms of reputation building. It's costs nothing to do, but it's a benefit that they can deliver. So increasingly, I would say, take a broader view and help customers take a broader view as well. Number 3, she found all these groups had fair and inclusive design making processes. Obviously, that speaks to governance. And so it's critically important to have a governance model that equally privileges all contributors. And as I say, I'm looking at you, corporate captive projects. A lot of, not all, but some corporate captive projects really don't equally privilege contributors. That's fine if you want to do it that way. Just be aware you probably won't be creating a healthy ecosystem when you do that. At least so says what we've learned from Elinor Ostrom's work. Secondly, fourth, she said monitoring agreed upon behaviors. These groups all had a way of monitoring agreed upon behaviors. Now, interestingly, I would ask the question, this assumes agreed upon behaviors exist. Do they? In the RTC OSS space, do we have agreed upon behaviors? We have licenses, and licenses say must. But what do we have that says should? I think to a large extent, we have nothing that says should, because of our overarching focus on licenses. And we need ways of saying should, ways of coercing consumers and producers to act in a certain way. But another thing I would say, a lesson we can take away is when organizations live up to the ideal behaviors of participation, we should probably do more to publicize and celebrate them. We should, because that paves the way, it shows the way for other customers to come along. So publicize and celebrate the organization that really live up to your ideals. Here's an interesting one. She said these groups had graduated sanctions for misbehaviors. So they didn't jump down your throat the first time you did something wrong. Now, the lesson for us is don't flame your users. Manage newcomers with a light touch. There's no dumb questions. Raise your hand if you've ever been flamed on an OSS mailing list. Maybe you asked a dumb question. Maybe you phrased it in a way that they felt was disrespectful. My hand's up because I've done that. I've felt that. And my response was, I don't want to go anywhere near those people again. So you need to have a light touch with newcomers. The best example I've personally experienced is with Sipwise and the RTP Engine project. I have asked a ton of dumb questions on their GitHub. And I have found it to be the most pleasant experience where they respond, they're helpful. It's really just the gold standard as far as I'm concerned for handling it. So I wanted to give them a shout out for that. The rest of the design principles that she had may not be quite as applicable to us. Fast and fair conflict resolution was very important in these groups. The authority to self-govern. So a lot of times these groups were managing natural resources and they needed it to be accepted by the local government that they were going to govern this in a community way. And then nested relations, appropriate relations with other groups, such as the bigger government. I'm not sure those apply as directly to us in the OSS space. She did some other interesting experiments I wanted to talk about, which speak to why can't we all just stay in our pajamas forever? Well, she did some really interesting studies on why face-to-face communication is so important. She ran a bunch of experiments where people were managing common pool resources, both with face-to-face ability to interact and without. And she found, in her own words, in the CPR common pool resource where individuals don't know each other, can't communicate effectively, that, okay, this is a bit wordy, she says it basically devolves to self-interest. You lose any sort of altruism. So face-to-face communication is very important, and we need to keep that in mind. And what does that mean? Well, it means we need more falcons. CompCon 22 must be in person. We need falcons. We need ducks being herded. We need inebriated geeks shooting oxbows into the sky. We need all that. We need it now, but maybe pretty please, Dan, next year we can have that again. But it's important. I'm being facetious, but it's important. There's no substitute for in-person conferences and other opportunities for face-to-face interactions. In fact, I always tell any of my customers that are looking for a way, the first thing they should do to support open source, support a conference, send people to it, sponsor it. That's the best first step anybody can possibly take because they're fostering the environment in which this stuff will grow, and that's critically important. Okay, now I want to switch to talk about evolutionary biology. There's a very interesting fellow who's done a lot of writing called David Sloan Wilson, evolutionary biologist, and he was focused on the theory of group selection and very interesting questions such as, does altruism pay? And altruism is important to us because altruism is basically the oxygen that open source communities need to thrive. So all of us are familiar with Darwin's theory of selection from our school days, which basically says that individuals are selected from a population based on their fitness for the environment. In other words, to put it simply, survival of the fittest. But a subgroup of biologists study the theory of multi-level selection or group selection, and that is the means by which groups are selected based on their traits. And here's where I stole my rule number 3. So his famous quote, I think here, especially when he was looking at the question of altruism, is that selfishness beats altruism within groups. So survival of the fittest will win out within groups. But if we're looking at group level competition, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. So and everything else is commentary. That's all that needed to be said, but a lot follows from that. In particular, we should therefore expect to see altruistic behavior when between group rivalries exceed within group competition. So when you've got that between group rivalry, then within those groups, you would expect to see a lot of altruism. When you don't, and you just got within group competition, you wouldn't expect to see much altruism. Now, there's an interesting experiment that was done in the 1990s at Purdue University, chicken laying experiment. So the goal was to increase the egg laying productivity of hens. And they did 2 simultaneous experiments. The first one was they monitored the hens, the number of eggs each hen laid, sort of took the winners and bred them together and did this through several generations, hoping to create, super egg producing hens. But what was the result? The result was the subsequent generations produced fewer eggs. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive. You would think, okay, Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest, we're going to get more eggs per hen by putting the really productive hens together. But the point was that hens exist and lay eggs in a social environment. They're about 6 to 8 per cage. And so as you were breeding egg production, you were also breeding aggressive behavior. So you would end up with cages where you might have 1 or 2 surviving hens and the others had been pecked to death. Now, interestingly, at the same time, they did another trial. And in this trial, they monitored eggs per cage. And then they would breed all the hens in that cage, generation after generation. In this case, egg production increased by 160%. So this is kind of a good example of group level selection in a social setting where the environment requires those sort of traits. And as he said, the results highlight the need for selection at the level of groups to evolve the traits that enable everyone within the group to thrive. Okay, what does that have to do with us? This relates how? Well, in the RTC OSS world, creating outstanding experience with the technology we have today means curating multiple OSS components. We're not looking for survival of the fittest. We're not looking for one winner. We're not looking for one project to rule them all. I'm a good example of that. My Jambones service is put together with Droctio, RTP Engine, FreeSwitch, API Ban. I could go on. And increasingly, that's what we're doing, assembling solutions from open source components. So we are really trying to create the most productive RTC community possible. So the lesson there is, like the hens, don't bully. In particular, never badmouth or seek to damage another OSS project, even a direct competitor. This has been, and this was kind of eye-opening to me. I came to open source from the commercial world. And in my company in the commercial world, we had one rule we used to say over and over to each other, and that was, the enemy's on the outside of these 4 walls. And why were we saying that? What were we trying to accomplish? We were trying to accomplish altruism within the 4 walls. We were trying to make it so that engineering didn't argue with sales when they brought back custom jobs tough to do, that engineering would take time out of their day to help train up new support people. And how did we create that altruism within the building? By making it clear that we had enemies outside the building. And that's the interesting thing about altruism. It's always got to be measured in a relative sense within a group. And so let's look at a couple of different type of group level selections and whether they would generate altruistic behavior or not. If you take the case of a combat unit, a small unit at war, here you have the conditions for group level selection, because they are literally under attack by other groups. You would expect to see a high level of altruism within that group, and in fact, of course, you do. Contrast that with the case of a train platform at rush hour. There's a group. There's no between group rivalries. There is no other group, and it degrades to survival of the fittest. You're going to push your way onto that train no matter what. If you don't, you'll be waiting for the next train and the next train and the next train after that. So the conditions are different, and they elicit different behaviors, either more or less altruism. I want to tell you a story, a true story about La Cosa Nostra, who you can imagine are probably a pretty tight-knit group. A buddy of mine was a federal prosecutor in the US, and he was prosecuting a case against the New York Mafia. And as part of that, they had some people that had turned state witnesses that were in the Mafia, and some of them were from Sicily in La Cosa Nostra. And he was deposing one of those witnesses who had turned state's evidence and he was from Sicily. He was in La Cosa Nostra. And the day before the trial, he was just walking him through a series of questions. They'd been through it all before. It was just, making sure the guy was prepped. Simple questions like, what's your name? Where were you born? And he comes to a question, he asks him, when did you join La Cosa Nostra? And the guy says, I never joined La Cosa Nostra. And my buddy is sweating bullets. It's like, they've been through this, the trial's tomorrow, what's going on? He asks again, when did you join? When did you join La Cosa Nostra? And the guy says again, now he's getting angry, I never joined La Cosa Nostra. My buddy is completely buffaloed. Then the guy says, one does not join La Cosa Nostra. One is absorbed by La Cosa Nostra. It's very important to him to make that point. But you can see the group level selection that was involved there. Now, we don't think of La Cosa Nostra as a particularly altruistic group, but probably within that group, if we could see within that group, probably a high level of altruism. But altruism is always relative. A lot of groups are very altruistic within themselves and brutal against other groups. Related thing to this is why copyleft should be permissive. So if you take the copyleft GPL versus the MIT open source crowd, copyleft GPL has an advantage. The advantage is it has a well-defined outgroup, right? GPL, the copyleft GPL people have an agenda of how they want to create a software commons and how people should work together. It's a well-defined agenda. And as a result, they have a pretty well-defined outgroup, which is people who don't believe in that agenda, who want software to be proprietary. MIT licenses doesn't really have such a well-defined outgroup because MIT licenses is basically, hey, you can use it however you want. So that's interesting. You would expect to see a tighter group in GPL than MIT. I think you probably do. But let's look at our own community. Do we have conditions in the RTC community that favors altruism? Now, generally, we're using the permissive. Most projects are using the permissive MIT license. So you'd think we kind of fail there. Well, I think there is altruism, and we can look at a couple of things. And again, if we're going to look for, well, where do we see this between group rivalry? One area, I think, is if we can look at SBC functionality. So we've got real-time communication OSS projects like Comet Helio and others that provide SBC functionality equal to or exceeding commercial vendors. And here we have a well-defined outgroup. It's the commercial SBCs, Ribbon, Oracle, etc. So do we see examples of within group altruism where we have this between group rivalry? And I would say, yes, we do. Just this week, as I'm recording it, OpenSIPIT is happening. So that's a group effort of many projects to do interoperability testing and get them access to features that will be needed to compete against commercial SBCs. These are completely different projects, open source, that will compete with themselves for customers, but are collaborating. And so we're seeing that altruistic effort. API bans by Fred is another great one. It's a way to level up to commercial level SBC protection. So we do see within group altruism, and we're seeing it in the parts of OSS where there's a well-defined group that we're competing against. I like to look at, the upcoming data privacy revolution as an opportunity to create between group rivalries that could also increase our altruism within RTC OSS. In this case, the outgroup is kind of big tech, Facebook, Twilio, etc. And it's a question I'm just posing, I don't have the answer. One would think if we focus on that, if we make that rivalry a focus, we would see within group altruism here as well. Now, my point is simply that if altruism requires certain conditions, we should be aware of those conditions and we should be thoughtful about how to create those conditions. So I'm just summarizing now the lessons that I think we can take back from evolutionary biology, from economics, are these. First, be inclusive, even of the customers that are not giving back. Think of them as the customers that are not giving back yet. Take a broad view of the benefits of OSS. Encourage your customers to do the same. There's many ways they can contribute that are free and no cost to them, and make sure they understand those. Have a governance model that privileges all equally. Give big shout outs to customers that do help. Manage your transgressors with a light touch at first. And by the way, we're all sinners. I've violated all of these rules over time. You probably will too, but all we can do is go to confession and then try to get better. Rule number 6, nothing substitutes for face-to-face interaction. So attend and sponsor conferences. This conference, if you're watching this conference later after it's given, ComCon is a fantastic event. And I'd love to see bigger companies, bigger service providers sponsor it and send people to it because it's a really valuable. And finally, never badmouth another OSS project, even your competitors. Well, thanks. That's all I had. Hopefully there was something in there for you. And I look forward to seeing you all in person next year.
Thanks, Dave. Like I said before, Dave is a dear friend of mine, and I trust his opinion totally when it comes to this kind of stuff and the health of open source and what we should all be what we should all be doing to make things better. So I've just been told there's a technical hitch, so I'm just gonna 1 second. I will be right back. I'm back. I'm back. Back on vMix. This is the power of the internet that we are. So I was gone for what 10 seconds. So Dave's here with me. Dave's with me. I don't really have anything that I don't have any questions that I want to pose to Dave, because like he answered so many of them already. And ultimately it's 8:15 at night. And I really want to go have a drink. So first, I wanted to say thank you very much, Dave, for helping and giving a really insightful talk that's on a topic that's close to everyone's hearts, but not enough people realize that it is close to their hearts until they get burned. So my question to you isn't anything to do with licensing at all. It is, if we do a ConCon 2022 in person, what is the most outlandish English countryside activity that you want to happen at ConCon 2022? And I realize I am putting you on the spot right now.
That's a good one. I don't know how you're going to beat what you've already done with duck herding and falcons, and maybe we could do jousting with, full on.
Jousting without horses, but with things that go really, really fast against opposite one another. That is a good idea. Yes, I don't have any questions because they've answered so many of them in his talk. And ultimately, licensing is such a complex problem. It's a complex conversation, right? And picking the right license and affects the whole community around your project, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I guess a proper question for you is have you ever made the mistake of licensing something completely and utterly wrongly, and then realizing that, like, later on down the line that you've done it wrong, and that you need to fix it?
I don't know if I have. I mean, I don't. I guess I can answer in a related way. I've considered a lot of different licenses and then sort of backed away. To date, I've have two main projects, and they're both licensed under the MIT license. Early on with Jambones, I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll do an open core thing and hold back some functionality. But it was that was not really supportive of my overall goal, which was to get the software out there and to let the software improve as fast as it could and to get it into people's hands. So it felt like putting brakes on the software when I thought about doing that. And to me, it was more important to push it out there. So I backed away from that, and I'm good, because I'm glad I did. I think that would have been a mistake for me. But again, for me, and for my particular agenda, which is a result of my experiences and everything that led up to this, so it would be a different decision for everybody. And that was one of the points of my talk. Was it's really hard to make black and white statements about licenses. It's really up to the person that. I mean, I think that's the right, when you create the intellectual property, is to choose how to license it. So for me, after a lot of consideration, I realized, I don't want to stand in the way of the software. So I chose the license for that purpose. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dave, and thank you for dealing with the technical hiccup so well. That's it for day one. If you're only just tuning in right now, where have you been? We're at the end. So go back on YouTube and watch all of them again. There's a playlist. And don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube, because that is the only way that we can do extra stuff on YouTube, because the YouTube gods say so. So thank you very much, Dave. We shall see everyone later. Thank you very much.